When I stopped by my friend's house after years away, I didn't expect his mom to open the door, smiling like she still remembered every version of me. By the time she teased, "You're too sweet, I could just eat you up," I wasn't sure if she was joking or confessing. The sun was beginning to dip, brushing the quiet street with gold, when I pulled up to the house I'd known since I was 12. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, the trees, the driveway, even the porch that used to feel like a stage for our teenage summers. My chest felt heavy with nostalgia. I hadn't been back here in years. I was supposed to be dropping off something for my old friend, Ryan, a quick errand before heading home. But when the door opened, it wasn't Ryan standing there. It was Laura, his mom. She stood in the doorway like time had slowed down for her. A loose sundress in soft cream, her hair swept up with a few strands escaping, catching the evening light. Her eyes widened in surprise before softening into recognition. "Ethan?" she said. Her voice touched with that familiar warmth I'd almost forgotten. "Hi, Mrs. Hale. It's been a while." She laughed lightly, the same melodic laugh that used to drift through the kitchen when she caught us sneaking snacks. "Please don't call me that anymore. It makes me feel ancient." There was a moment of stillness. I noticed the faint scent of vanilla and lavender clinging to her, the kind of softness that lingers even after someone walks away. She stepped closer and opened her arms without hesitation. I hesitated for just a second. Then she pulled me into a hug. It wasn't a polite, distant hug. It was familiar, full-bodied, the kind that says "I remember you." Her cheek brushed mine lightly. I could feel the quiet steadiness of her breathing, and somewhere in that moment, something shifted. When she pulled back, her smile was gentler, more searching. "You've changed," she said softly, eyes tracing my face. "I wouldn't have recognized you if you hadn't smiled like that." I smiled again, trying not to stare too long. "Guess I grew up." She tilted her head with a small, amused look, half teasing, half reflective. "You certainly did." For a moment, neither of us said anything. The late sunlight poured between us, warming the edges of her hair, the line of her collarbone, the soft fabric of her dress fluttering against the doorframe. It was such a simple thing, just standing there, but it felt strangely electric. I handed her the small package Ryan had asked me to drop off. "He said you'd want this?" "Oh, thank you," she said, taking it and brushing her fingers against mine. A fleeting touch, light as a whisper, but enough to make my pulse quicken. She didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did. "Ryan's out right now," she said after a pause, voice smoothing back into calm. "But you can come in if you'd like." I was just about to make some tea. The invitation hung there between us. I told myself it was just neighborly kindness, nothing more. But as I stepped through the doorway and felt the familiar air of that house wrap around me, I realized something. It wasn't just nostalgia that made my heart race. It was her. The years hadn't changed that, they'd only deepened it. The house hadn't changed much. The same soft yellow walls, the same framed photographs along the hallway. Only the quiet was new. It felt lived in, but peaceful, like time had slowed down inside these walls. Laura moved around the kitchen with an easy grace, the rhythm of someone who found comfort in small routines. "I wasn't expecting company," she said with a laugh, tying her hair back as she opened the oven. "But I made enough for two." The air filled with the smell of rosemary and garlic. I sat at the edge of the counter, watching her work, trying to act casual while my pulse betrayed me. She moved like music, deliberate, unhurried, every motion laced with confidence. "Ryan told me you were working out of the city now," she said, glancing at me over her shoulder. "Big job, big life?" "Busy life," I corrected, "but not as big as I thought it'd feel." She smiled, half amused, half knowing. "It rarely is." There was something about her tone, calm, steady, touched with experience, that made me want to tell her more. I didn't, not yet. Instead, I watched the steam curl from the pan and tried to remember the last time someone had spoken to me like that, without hurry or pretense. When dinner was ready, she set the table for two, lighting a small candle between us. Rain had begun to fall outside, soft and rhythmic, tapping against the windows. The world felt smaller, just the two of us and the warmth of the kitchen. "Do you still take your coffee with too much sugar?" she teased as she poured our wine. I laughed. "You remember that?" "I remember everything," she said, her eyes glinting playfully. "You and Ryan used to spill half of it on my counter every morning before school." I smiled, shaking my head. "You were the only one who didn't yell at us for it." "That's because I secretly liked having you both around," she said, then paused, realizing the weight in her words. Her eyes softened. "You were good kids, good hearts." Her compliment lingered. I wanted to answer, but the lump in my throat stopped me. I took a sip of wine instead. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was the kind that hums quietly between two people who don't need to fill every space with sound. She reached across the table to hand me the bread basket, her fingers brushing mine for a second. A small, natural gesture, yet it felt like a spark. My breath caught. She noticed, maybe because her gaze flickered downward, then back up again. Outside, the rain grew heavier. Inside, the warmth seemed to close in. Not suffocating, but intimate. As if the world had chosen this small kitchen to hide us from everything else. She laughed suddenly, eyes bright. "You've gone quiet on me, Ethan." I smiled faintly. "Just remembering." Her voice softened. "Me too." For the first time that evening, I realized we weren't just catching up. We were finding each other again. Two people from different times, sitting across a table that suddenly felt far too small. The rain hadn't stopped by the time dinner ended. It had softened into a steady hush, a quiet percussion that wrapped the house in calm. Laura gathered the plates, her sleeves rolled up, the candlelight from the kitchen table tracing soft gold over her forearms. I offered to help, but she waved me off with a grin. "You always were terrible at dishes," she teased, glancing over her shoulder. "Still am," I admitted, leaning against the counter. "But I make a great audience." She laughed, a warm, melodic sound that filled the room. "Then sit. I'll give you a show." I watched her as she rinsed the dishes, humming softly to some tune I didn't recognize. The air smelled like rain and rosemary, with a faint undertone of her perfume. Something floral, something alive. The small kitchen, once ordinary, felt like the center of the world. When she finally joined me in the living room, she carried 2 mugs of tea. "You still take honey, right?" I blinked, surprised she remembered. "Yeah, always have." She smiled knowingly, settling beside me on the couch. The lamplight was low, softening the edges of everything. Outside, the streetlights blurred behind streaks of water on the window. A slow jazz record played from a speaker in the corner, the saxophone filling the silence between words. We talked about nothing and everything. Her garden, my work, the little things we missed when life got too loud. There was something unguarded about her tonight. Her voice carried traces of laughter and loneliness, wrapped together like melody and echo. At one point, I told her, "I forgot how easy it is to talk to you." Her eyes met mine, warm, steady, unreadable. "You've grown into such a kind man, Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Too kind, maybe. Is that a bad thing?" She smiled, tilting her head. "It's sweet." And then, with that same playful curve of her lips, she said it soft, teasing, almost like a secret slipping out. "You're too sweet," she murmured, leaning slightly closer. "I could just eat you up." The words hung in the air, delicate but dangerous. My heart stumbled. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or hold my breath. Her tone was playful, yet there was something underneath it. Something warm, something that felt like it wasn't entirely a joke. I tried to answer, but all I managed was a nervous chuckle. "Careful," I said, forcing a grin. "I might believe you." Her eyes glimmered, amused. "Maybe you should." The air between us grew quiet again, thick with a new kind of awareness. The record crackled faintly. Outside, thunder rumbled somewhere far away. I caught the faintest rise and fall of her breathing, slow and steady, as if she, too, was holding the moment in her hands. Neither of us moved. The teasing smile faded into something gentler, something searching. Then she looked away, sipping her tea as if nothing had happened. But everything had. Because after that moment, every glance, every word, every heartbeat in that room carried a question we were both too careful to ask. The first thing I heard that morning was the rain easing into silence. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed and still. Light spilled across the guest room, soft and gold, pooling over the old wooden floor. For a moment I didn't move. I just lay there, listening to the quiet, the kind that follows an evening you can't quite define. Last night kept replaying in fragments. Her laughter, the warmth in her voice, the way her words, "You're too sweet, I could just eat you up," had lingered long after she'd said them. They had felt like a tease, but beneath the playfulness, there'd been something else. Something neither of us had the courage to name. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to shake the thought, but it clung like mist. I heard the faint clatter of dishes downstairs, the sound of the kettle whistling, and her voice humming again, low, tuneless, comforting. When I finally went down, the smell of freshly brewed coffee greeted me before anything else. Laura stood by the counter, barefoot, wearing a loose gray sweater that fell off one shoulder. Her hair gathered messily like she'd just woken up. She looked so natural, so at ease, that for a second I forgot to breathe. She turned and smiled, her eyes lighting with something soft. "Good morning, stranger." "Morning," I said, rubbing my neck awkwardly. "Sorry, I must have overslept." "You needed it," she replied easily. "You always did." Her words carried that quiet familiarity again, the kind that made my chest tighten. She poured a cup of coffee and slid it toward me. Our fingers brushed, just slightly, and my pulse jumped. Ridiculous, really, for something so small. The air between us felt delicate, like a thread stretched too tight. I wanted to say something light, but the words didn't come. Instead, I watched her move. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the way the sunlight caught the edge of her cheekbone. "You were quiet last night," she said suddenly, still facing the sink. I hesitated. "I guess I didn't want to ruin a good evening." She looked over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. "You couldn't have ruined it." For a moment our eyes held steady, searching. Then she smiled faintly, as if to soften what she'd just said. "I hope I didn't embarrass you," she murmured. "I was teasing. It's an old habit." Her voice carried a tremor, so faint most people wouldn't have noticed. But I did. There was more beneath her words, regret, maybe, or something like fear. I took a sip of coffee, letting the warmth steady me. "You didn't embarrass me," I said quietly. "It was just unexpected." She exhaled, relief and something else mixing in her smile. "Good," she whispered. Outside, the clouds were breaking apart. Light filtered through the window, catching the steam rising between us. The silence that followed wasn't awkward anymore. It was full, heavy with the kind of understanding that doesn't need words. And as she reached across the counter to grab the sugar, her arm grazed mine. The touch was brief, accidental maybe, but it left a warmth that stayed long after she'd turned away. Neither of us said a thing. But in that quiet kitchen, under the morning light, something unspoken began to grow. Fragile, real, and impossible to ignore. By late afternoon, the rain had given way to sunlight, that soft, golden kind that makes everything seem gentler than it is. From the window, I saw Laura in the garden, kneeling among the flowers. The air outside shimmered with the scent of wet soil and jasmine. I hesitated for a moment before stepping out, unsure if I was interrupting something that wasn't mine to enter. She looked up when she heard the door. A streak of dirt smudged her cheek, and her smile, unguarded, almost shy, felt different from the polished warmth she wore inside. "You're up early for someone who slept half the morning," she said, her voice teasing but kind. I shrugged, picking up a small spade from the patio table. "Thought I'd help before you banish me back to the city." She laughed softly. "Help? You used to trample every plant you touched." "Then maybe I've learned," I said. "People change." "Do they?" she asked quietly, half to herself. The conversation drifted into the rhythm of work. She handed me a pot of seedlings, her fingers brushing mine, damp and cool. The earth was dark and rich under my nails, the sun warm on the back of my neck. It was simple, grounding, but beneath that simplicity was something stirring, alive. After a while, she sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "This garden keeps me sane," she said softly. "It's something to care for when the rest feels too heavy." I looked at her, the way the light caught in her hair, the faint lines at the corner of her eyes that only made her more striking. "You make it beautiful," I said without thinking. She smiled, but it faltered almost instantly. "Beauty doesn't last, Ethan. It fades. You just learn to love what stays after." Her tone had changed, quiet, almost brittle. I didn't answer right away. The garden felt still, even the wind seemed to pause. "You don't really believe that," I said. Her gaze flicked to mine, steady but vulnerable. "I've learned not to expect much," she admitted. "People leave. Life rearranges itself. You find a way to keep breathing." There was a silence that pressed against my chest. I wanted to say something that mattered, something that might ease whatever she was carrying, but all I could do was kneel closer. "You shouldn't have to do that alone." Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to argue, then closed again. The faintest tremor crossed her face. "You remind me what it feels like to be seen," she said finally, voice trembling around the edges. The words hit me harder than I expected. She reached for a rose behind her, careful of the thorns, and handed it to me. "For helping," she said, trying to smile. Our fingers touched again, that small, familiar spark, and I didn't let go right away. Her breath caught. For the first time, she didn't look away. The world around us was alive. The hum of bees, the whisper of leaves, the soft pull of sunlight. But between us, there was a quiet that felt sacred. She didn't need to say anything more. In that garden, among the roots and rain-soaked petals, her heart had already spoken. The storm rolled in again that evening, a slow, deliberate arrival. Clouds gathered like old memories, heavy and gray, and thunder murmured in the distance. I was sitting by the window, half lost in thought, when Laura called from the kitchen. "Power's flickering again," she said, her voice calm despite the thunder's growing impatience. A moment later, the lights went out completely. The house fell into a velvet darkness, broken only by the sound of rain hammering the roof. I found her in the kitchen, already lighting candles, their small, trembling flames throwing soft halos of gold across her face. "Well," she sighed, a faint smile touching her lips. "Looks like it's just you, me, and the storm again." There was warmth in her tone, but something quieter beneath it. A question neither of us wanted to ask aloud. I took one of the candles from her, our fingers brushing. "Guess it's a sign," I said lightly. "A sign of what?" I met her eyes. "That maybe we're meant to talk." She gave a small, nervous laugh, but didn't look away. "You always were good at saying things I wasn't ready to hear." We settled in the living room, the rain drumming softly against the windows. The air smelled faintly of wax and wet air, that clean scent that follows thunder. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, sitting close enough that our knees nearly touched. The flickering candlelight painted her features in warmth. Her cheekbones, her lips, her eyes that seemed to hold too much at once. For a while, we talked about the storm, about her garden, about nothing. But under every word, something deeper pulsed, like the steady beat of a heart waiting to be acknowledged. At one point, lightning flashed through the room, sudden and white. She flinched, just slightly, and before I could think, I reached for her hand. It was instinct, simple, human. But when she didn't pull away, when her fingers tightened around mine, the air changed. The thunder outside faded into background noise. I could feel her pulse, fast and steady beneath her skin. Her voice broke the silence, soft and unguarded. "Ethan, this is dangerous." "I know," I said quietly, "but it feels honest." She looked at me then, really looked, her eyes full of conflict, of longing, of something that had been waiting too long. The candlelight danced across her face, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The world was just that small space between our joined hands. "I don't want to hurt you," she whispered. "You couldn't," I replied. "You've only made me remember what it feels like to care." Her breath trembled. She looked down at our hands, then back up, her eyes shining faintly. "You shouldn't say things like that," she murmured. "I might start believing them." The thunder rumbled again, closer this time. We sat there, silent, the storm pressing gently against the walls while the warmth between us grew. When she finally leaned her head lightly against my shoulder, it felt less like a decision and more like surrender. Quiet, inevitable, and utterly human. Outside, the rain washed the world clean. Inside, neither of us spoke another word. We didn't need to. The silence said everything. Morning came softly, the kind of morning that feels like a whisper after a long confession. The storm had passed, leaving the world glistening and still. Sunlight poured through the curtains in slow ribbons, and the air smelled faintly of rain and coffee. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, as if reminding the day to begin. I woke on the couch, the blanket she'd placed over me still carrying the faint warmth of her touch. The candles from last night had melted down to puddles of wax. Everything was quiet, too quiet to feel casual. The kind of quiet that holds something sacred, something fragile. I found her in the kitchen, already dressed, her hair tied back neatly this time. The soft sweater she wore last night had been replaced by a crisp blouse. The transformation was subtle, but it was enough to remind me. She was rebuilding her walls. "Morning," I said, my voice still low, hesitant. She turned, smiling in that gentle, practiced way. "Good morning. You slept in." "Didn't mean to," I murmured. "Guess it was a long night." Her eyes flickered for just a second. A flash of memory, of what wasn't said but had been felt. Then she turned back to the counter. "Coffee, please." As she poured, the small sounds, the spoon tapping the mug, the drip of coffee, the hum of distant wind, filled the silence between us. It wasn't uncomfortable, just tender, like both of us were trying not to break something invisible. I took the cup from her hand. Our fingers brushed again. Brief, accidental, but familiar now. She looked down, then smiled softly. "You're leaving today, aren't you?" "Yeah. I should get back before it gets late." She nodded, her voice steady. "Ryan will probably be home this weekend. He'll want to see you." I wanted to say I'd come back for her, but the words stayed behind my teeth. There was too much meaning in them, too much risk. So I just nodded, pretending to sip my coffee. For a moment, she leaned against the counter, looking out the window at the wet garden. "It's funny," she said quietly. "You come home for a day, and suddenly the house feels alive again." Her words carried that familiar mix of warmth and ache. I set my cup down and stepped closer, stopping just behind her. "Maybe it's not the house," I said softly. She turned to face me. There it was again, that look. Gentle, uncertain, threaded with something she didn't have to name. "Ethan," she said finally, her voice barely above a breath. "Don't make this harder." "I'm not trying to," I said. But before I could finish, she closed the space between us. Not with a kiss, not even with words, but with a hug that said everything words couldn't. Her arms slipped around me, her cheek resting lightly against my chest. I felt her heartbeat. Steady, quiet, real. When she finally pulled back, her eyes shone with something bright and soft. "You'll visit again, won't you?" "I will," I said, the words leaving my mouth like a promise I didn't know how to keep but wanted to. At the door, sunlight poured across her face. She smiled. Not the practiced kind this time, but one filled with unspoken hope. As I walked down the path toward my car, I glanced back once. She was still there, framed in the doorway, watching. And I knew, whatever this was, however impossible, something between us had begun. Not a fire, not a storm. Something quieter. Something that would last. If this story touched you, if you've ever felt that quiet pull between what is and what might be, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes in slow, meaningful love. Every story here is about connection, not perfection. And if you'd like more heartfelt, age gap romance stories like My Friend's Mom Teased, You're Too Sweet, I Could Just Eat You Up, stay with me. Your support helps keep these gentle, human stories alive.